Hi, everyone. Welcome to Author's Voice, a virtual book signing network. I'm your host, Sonali Dev, and this is Lit with Love, a show about romance novels and the authors who write them. Today, we are talking to the very lovely Meredith Duran about her new book, A Lady's Code of Misconduct, which was utterly delightful, Meredith. And we had Julia Quinn on the show a few shows back, and we talked about how every author should write at least one or has the license to write at least one amnesia book. So this is Meredith's amnesia book. Is this your only one? Okay.
It is, yes.
All right. But before we get started, I'm going to help our viewers kind of navigate our show. So you get to, I think there's a Ask Questions button below us. So please click on there and send us your questions live, and we'll try to get to them. We do have a whole lot of questions, and if you send them in, thank you so much. You can also buy a signed copy of Meredith's book, and I hope that you will. So welcome, Meredith.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And I have to say, it was so much fun, because I think that this is definitely everything an amnesia book should be. But the first thing and I was not expecting it to be an amnesia book.
So a little subtle on the back cover.
Yes, because, and also when you start out, it was almost, I think in terms of tropes, because in Romancelandia we love to talk about that, there was that whole enemies to lovers thing going on. And what really struck me when I started reading it is, my gosh, this guy is a real-time villain. Like he's, you know, he's not alpha hole, you know, he's not adorable, awful. He's a jerk, and he's really dark, and you know, he's gone all the way over to the evil side almost. And then boom, he loses you know, the years that it took him to get there. So I do want you to kind of take us into where all of that came from, and you know, what the story inspiration was. But I also want to talk about that whole painting yourself into a corner in terms of process. But we can come back to it. Tell us where this book came from.
Well, you've touched on it. So I'd written 10 books before this, and I thought, okay, 10 books, I deserve a reward. And so I decided I was finally going to let myself write two of my favorite tropes as a reader, which were the villain turned to hero on the page. You know, not in a previous book. We don't just bring him back and then rehabilitate him from the get-go, but actually start out with somebody who's very dark. And the second would be, of course, the amnesia plot, which Julia's right. Like, everyone gets one, right? It is so much fun, and he seemed perfect for it. Yeah, I mean, the book, I was thinking about, Jane Mason is the heiress, right, the heroine of the book, and she is in a bad situation at the start. She is holed up in the countryside, kept there by her guardian, who's also her uncle, who is not eager for Jane's money to escape the family grasp. And so he has kept her basically on this estate for quite a while, and she knows marriage is her only chance at escape. He has a political partner in crime, Crispin Burke, who is a notorious blackguard who has amassed his power through very underhanded means. And when one of Crispin's potentially innumerable enemies attacks him and basically puts him on his deathbed, Jane sees her chance. She thinks, well, he's going to die, and I can manufacture evidence that we were actually married, and then voila, I am free. Of course, he wakes up. And he wakes up with no memory of his most sort of recent years and his descent into villainy, basically. And he thinks he's realized all of his childhood aspirations. And he thinks that he and Jane are really married, and he looks to her as his helpmeet in maintaining this incredible accomplishment. And he's at the edge of becoming the prime minister, and he needs her help. Meanwhile, of course, she's terrified he's going to regain his memories and accuse her of forgery and fraud, and also revert to the sort of very nasty person he was before. And yet at the same time, she is falling for this new person he's showing himself to be. So the stakes are pretty high for her. And that was sort of, the kernel of it was, how do I really write a villain, an unrepentant villain at the beginning, and make him someone worthy of love by the end. But it was also really important to me that Jane was not merely the sort of golden, innocent foil. She starts out seeming quite noble, but she has to confront some of the grittier aspects of her own personality in this journey.
Yeah, and there's so much to unpack in there. So let me first step back to the question I started to fold into my first question and make it too big. But because you do go as a reader, whoa, like, is this where we're going with this kind of thing? And then because he's so dark, because he wakes up not dark at all and completely at odds with who he now is, because she's in this, this situation where she's taken advantage of him, the master advantage taker, so to speak.
And game.
Right? And so there's so much of, painting yourself into a corner that happens there. So, and I think one of the best things about a genre like romance is that we know the ending, right? So it's like putting this puzzle together, and one of the best things as a reader that can happen to you is you go, I have no idea how she's going to make this okay for these two, because we know they're going to be okay in the end, and the more we don't know, the more fun that book is. And so in terms of process, when you were writing it, did you have the whole thing plotted out, or did you paint yourself into a corner? Like, what was it?
Yeah, so this book was particularly challenging to write, I would say. I will admit that I wrote about 300 pages and threw them out, which was a little painful. I am not a plotter, I have to admit. I do plot every book from start to finish, and what that guarantees is that the book will never be written that way. It is not a process I would recommend to anyone, but after, this is what, I'm on my book 12 now, so I've just accepted that my process is nonsensical and just needs to be endured. Yeah, I really enjoyed the fact that while this book did, as I said, take a lot out of me before it finally hit the page, those 300 pages that were chucked were not wasted, because I don't know what was happening in the back of my head throughout all of that, where I felt like I was fighting through cement. But when I started over from page 1, which I really did, it just clicked. So some part of my subconscious was obviously like at work when I was, ripping my hair out at the keyboard. And it did, and it actually, I think, is probably one of my most tightly, it feels one of my most tightly plotted books. I usually, when I plot, what I call plotting is actually thinking about the characters. The characters to me and their greatest fears, their weaknesses, are actually what I think that their life partner needs to hit again and again and again to ensure that they're actually going to be able to grow as a result of finally coming to love each other. And for Crispin, it was pretty clear what needed to be done from the get-go. Jane actually was the one who was a little bit more opaque to me for a while, until I realized she wasn't actually a good girl. She was telling herself she was a good girl, but that what Crispin had to offer her eventually was proof of her own faults and the fact that they were okay, that actually her faults are the reason that at the end, when he has sort of recovered, I'm gonna spoil it, sorry y'all, he recovers his memory. I think you knew that was coming. But that, her faults are actually equally a part of why they are perfect for each other. So once I had that, then suddenly how it had to happen revealed itself to me.
That's a great segue into the other thing I wanted to talk about, because you say she's not a good girl. And I think that has so much to do with authenticity for that time, because she's a perfectly good girl for us, now.
Yes, absolutely.
And one of the things for me with this book, and often with historicals, is that, the feminist aspect of it, right? Because in a way we're kind of projecting today's feminism into the past.
Yes.
But as someone who grew up in a specific culture, I completely understand that disconnect between what your family tells you is who you should be and how things should be, and the society at large believing something different. And that to me, with Jane, was like bingo. That one thing with a character that like really hits, because she's raised to believe she's a thinking, brilliant, human being, and the world at large is at odds with that thought process, right? Which just I hooked into so much, and how you then reconcile that, right, as a woman, and I think that it happens today, right? But it in subtler ways. So there's so much. There's so much feminist. This narrative is so feminist, and I had to in little things, right? And I did want to talk to you about how whether that's overt. You think how where that comes from in the book. But I did want to read a line which was, which shows how it's woven into the fabric of the book. This is they're having they're doing the nasty, and and this is just one line in there. She says, she's opening his buttons and they flipped open easily. Men's buttons were not designed as armor. So it's this little thing where the difference between what it takes to undress a woman and undress a man, and this is full of gems like that. But you want to talk a little bit about the feminism in your books?
Yeah, I think that there's an interesting quandary in front of historical novelists in general, and particularly for historical romance novelists, because we're not merely, we're trying to create a love story that is going to speak to contemporary readers and stir their emotions, right? As well as in many regards, trying to stick Hugh as closely to the worldviews of that time as are palatable to us today, right? Because a sense of place and a sense of immersion is what I look for as a reader in historical romance, and so what I try to impart as well as a writer. In Jane's case, I think perhaps, I always hesitate to interpret my own books because I feel like that's really the reader's job, not mine. But if I dare be so bold, I think that what makes her less than a good girl in a way that might echo today is that her ambitions are really acute and very strong. And they aren't necessarily the kinds of ambitions that are generally interpreted even today as being feminine or becoming to a woman. They're not exactly the kinds of, we don't really have too many praiseworthy terms for an extraordinarily ambitious woman, right? And that's sad, and that's something that we're still working on as a culture. And so I think that was something I really connected with Jane on when writing and crafting her character. The fact that, she was willing to pull one over on Crispin. She didn't feel like she had to apologize. She did what she had to do, because she felt like her freedom was worth it. Yeah.
Yeah, and kudos. It's a spectacular job with that, and I think so timely, right? And I would love to ask you, why this book? Why now?
I can't. This is interesting. I did get a lot of emails that were like, did you write this in response to the political climate in our country right now? There's no explicit yes to that. Like, the book obviously was boiling in my brain through, where does any idea come from? Obviously, we live in the world and we draw our inspiration from what we're absorbing every day from it. But it was not intended as an explicit rebuttal or commentary on anything right now. There is a political debate at the heart of this book, but it's on penal reform and on parole, which is something that we as a society have fully embraced. So,
which is another spectacular segue into what I wanted to talk about, because again, we're presidential, England's parliamentary, and so that I couldn't imagine that research wasn't. So tell us a little bit more about your research, travel, readings.
Yeah, so I have spent a lot of time in various interviews praising Google Books because it has made research so much easier. And I am a master procrastinator through research. I love it. And in this book, I loved it a little less because it's a little less entertaining to be reading through parliamentary records of speeches. But that scene in which he does give a speech in Parliament terrified me before I wrote it. I've never done anything like that before. The House of Lords has changed a lot since, 1861 when he gives his, 1860, pardon me, when he gives his speech. So first I, was reconstructing what it would have looked like, how he would have moved through it. He obviously is a little disoriented as a result of his brain injury, so it was very important for him to understand and plot out exactly how he would get to the floor of the House of Commons. But then the actual speech My husband was around when I was writing that, and he can attest. I was standing in the kitchen, and I was like, okay, I just have to do it, because I'd spent like 5 or 6 days completely immersed in those records from that time period. And I was pretty proud of how it turned out, actually. It was really satisfying. I think the research paid off. I don't think I'll be revisiting parliamentary records for fun or light reading anytime soon, but I have a huge debt of gratitude to Google Books that's made so much of that public and so easily accessible.
Yeah, and you absolutely should be proud, and I seem to kind of, come back with that for every one of your answers. But as you're reading this book, you've set it up so that speech is pivotal. You even, I think, call it, the speech of his life or the speech of his career. And I was, as a writer myself, I was a little bit like, oh my gosh, how is she going to pull this off? And you totally do, and you pull it off, I think, surprisingly. It's not quite all drama. It goes to a place of emotion and touching character and change, which kind of is the other question. Thematically, what I loved, and we need to get to the questions, so this will be my last question, so I will get to your questions. I think that the idea of human potential and what happens to it as we make choices, and I think that's possibly why amnesia books are such a thing, right? If you forget who you were in the interim from a time where you could have been anybody. Right, that whole, so thematically, what was that something that kind of called to you with this book?
I think so. I think that there is something just inherently dramatic and deeply intriguing about the idea of suddenly wiping away, becoming a blank slate again and seeing, would you make the same choices? Is there such a thing? Is character destiny? If character is destiny, to what extent does it interact with chance? Crispin had reasons for becoming the villain he did. He did not have Jane in his life. And I think that it is true that while one's character absolutely shapes one's course, one's character is also deeply influenced by the people around you and the way they see you, the way they are reflecting you back to yourself. And so I think that, the commentary here, if anything, is that he's very lucky that he could have retread that path, but she was there now, and that made the difference.
Okay, yeah, and that whole, also the juxtaposition of who he is, who he could have become. And I think another thing that, makes the amnesia not quite as much of a device is the fact that you do that. Overlaying of who he is, who he was, and bring it all together, and don't just discard one part of him entirely.
He
so that was
reintegrates.
fabulous. yes, really, really well. Thanks. And let's get to some
absolutely.
some reader questions, and I think I'm going to start with the one from your dad.
Thank you, Dad.
It's Dad. And his question is: do you ever wish you could be one of your characters? If so, who?
I put my characters through the ringer. Dad, you will know this because you have read my books. So I think I'm quite grateful that I am not one of my characters, not least because I would have had a very difficult time, as difficult, if not more so, than some of my heroines in dealing with the restrictions placed on ladies' public behavior in the 19th century. At the same time, I am particularly drawn to some of my heroines. There's Lydia from Bound by Your Touch, who I actually, in the writing of it, this is the first time I shall confess this, I came up with a nickname for her because I was so frustrated with her. I called her the Lydiot at certain points because I was so mad at how incredibly constricted she felt by a role that she herself had willingly taken on. At the same time, her intellectual curiosity and her dreams of exploring the world and her willingness to question everything she'd been taught really spoke to me. So I like the idea of what Lydia is doing with her life, and I think I'd probably choose Lydia if I had to choose one of my heroines.
I love Lydia, by the way. That was just
I hope she forgives me in her imaginary home. She knew it came from love.
All right. And this is from, oh goodness, Jillian. Okay. Hi, Jillian. Meredith Duran has hands down some of the most beautiful prose I've ever read, she says.
Thank you.
And where did she learn to write like that? Was it school? Any tips?
Oh gosh, my only tip is to be an avid reader. I read to the point where sometimes I fear it's obsessive and unhealthy. I usually have like 5 or 6 books going at the same time. And I have been writing obsessively as well since I first picked up a pen. I tortured my 3rd grade teacher. He gave us an assignment to make up, we didn't know what the word quirt meant. It's actually the letters on a typewriter or keyboard. He asked us to write a story about what quirt was, and I wrote the first installment about a donkey, and he liked it, and then I kept writing, and like 12 days later, he was like, that's enough. Like, you don't need to give me any more. So I think it's just practice and a deep and omnivorous reading habit that you begin to understand how language should feel and the rhythm of where it should stop and where it should start, just by absorbing other people's language, I think. But thank you for the compliment. That means a lot.
Okay, this is from Matthew. What draws you as a writer to historical romance in particular? And I know you just wrote something that wasn't historical. I did not know this, but I want to talk about that, which is why he asks.
Oh, okay. I did. I wrote like a novella for an anonymous anthology. So we haven't actually put our specific names to the stories yet. And it was not historical. I can say that safely because none of them were historical. It was a fun project. I do love historicals best because I started out as a reader loving historical fiction, and I love the idea, and fantasy, which I actually think go hand in hand because both of them, when they're great, they immerse you in a different time and place and culture and way of thinking. And I just love that feeling of getting swept away. And on top of that, I love doing research on like the history of everyday life, and historical romance gives me the excuse to do that and call it work, which is fantastic.
So this one, again, it's a day of segues for us today. So she says that this book, Ladies' Code of Misconduct, was her 2nd favorite of your books.
Okay.
Duke of Shadows was her first.
Yeah.
And she says that you write in 3 different time periods. Which time period do you enjoy writing most in, and why? And how do you select the time period for your books? And this is from Maggie. Thank you, Maggie.
Okay, thanks, Maggie. I guess the 3rd period would be At Your Pleasure. That was very early Georgian during the Jacobite uprising in 1715. That was a fantastic period because it was extremely political and fractious, and so the entire plot could sort of adhere around this massive conflict that was sort of separating or causing a lot of chaos in England. I'm not sure I'd revisit that time period though, because it was a very dark book necessarily based on what was happening. I think probably the 1880s are where I've written most of my books, or set them rather, because there's more possibility for women. Women were joining the workforce, they were bicycling around town, and so there's a lot more scope for a heroine to really stretch her wings and follow her desires. But the 1860s, which is where Our Lady's Code and Duke of Shadows was set, was also a really interesting period because it's the height of the Victorian era, the height of that culture of domesticity, and hence the very start of the rebellion against it. And so it's really interesting to write books in that time period to sort of trace the widening fault lines, as it were.
That's fabulous, yeah, where the seeds were sown, right? Or
Exactly.
at least the seeds first started to germinate, so that's lovely. Why did it take you so long to write Lockwood's book when you first mentioned him in this? I love these questions in your debut, and this is from Jamie.
Merciless Jamie. It is true, Lockwood first appeared in Duke of Shadows, and now he's cropped up again, a mention of him at least in Ladies' Code of Misconduct, and his book is next. I have to apologize, I get a lot of emails about Lockwood. Where is Lockwood's book? It is coming now. Lockwood is a very complicated character. Lockwood's backstory is probably the most dramatic backstory of any hero I've ever written about. He was hit on his head on his wedding day, tossed onto a prison bark, and shipped to a penal colony in Australia by unknown assailants. So he has some issues. His wife has some issues because she doesn't know that he left under duress. She thinks he took off because she has good reasons to think that. And so it was just an intensely complicated story, further complicated by his psychology, which is, as you can imagine, having been wrongly imprisoned for a couple of years, rather fraught with issues to resolve. But I think his book is coming out at the end of February, and I think and I hope it will have been worth the wait. But again, sorry, it did take me a while.
Do you want to tell the viewers what that book is called?
It is called The Sins of Lord Lockwood,
Nice.
for he has not behaved well.
And you'll come back and talk to us about it
Absolutely.
in February.
Yeah.
All right. This is from Susan Lord. Hi, Susan. And she says that this was her favorite historical this year, and she loved Crispin and Jane's emotional love story, and she has been rereading her favorite parts. Her question is, did you struggle with how to start their story? She really enjoyed beginning in his point of view, waking up without any memory and all that followed. But did you or your editors question the nonlinear structure?
My editor is incredibly indulgent of me. She, you know, if I really fight for something, she says, "All right, let's see if you can make it work, Duran." And you know, up till this point, knock on wood, I have. But yeah, the nonlinear thing, it had originally started, you know, with chronologically with Jane and Crispin and their very tense meeting when Jane tries to basically make a break for it from her uncle's house. And then I thought, there is a danger with starting a story and continuing when he is truly such an unrepentant and rather frightening blackguard. So I thought, you know, if I were a reader reading this story, I would feel deeply uneasy, and I would need some kind of reassurance that there is another side to him. And that is why, for the first time, I've never done this in a book before, I did actually break chronological order and open the book with him waking up with no memory, because then I thought, well, at least people know he's going to get what's coming to him.
It was very, very clever structurally, because I do also remember thinking, oh, this is fabulous how she did it. And I was wondering at what point you were going to bring us back.
Yeah.
And you do it in the first 1/3.
Yeah,
so
I try to make people not wait too long, because I know as a reader I get tremendously impatient and I have no discipline. I will skip ahead to settle a question and then go back. So I wanted to make sure nobody felt they had to do that.
I was about to do that, and then you gave me what I needed, so I didn't have to cheat. You've kind of addressed these questions, but I'll read them out anyway. Was it a smooth or bumpy trip returning to the time of Duke of Shadows for the new book? And that's from Karen, mom of Norman Brad.
Oh, hi, Karen. Yes, a smooth or bumpy trip. That's a really good question, actually. I have been so immersed in the 1880s that it did take, I spent a couple of months rereading all of the books. As I've said, I love social history. I have a massive bookshelf full of, the history of everyday life in the 19th century. And I did spend a couple of months reminding myself that I was not in the 1880s anymore. That there was not, because some of my books, they have electricity at this point. Big step backward in that regard as well. Had to sort of get my head around moving in hoop skirts again, which actually you'd be surprised, a lot more comfortable moving a hoop skirt than in those narrow skirts of the early 1880s. Just a sense of sort of re-inhabiting that time period. But you know what, it is sort of the height of what we imagine when we think about Victorian England, the pea supers and the gaslight and, the nights where it's so dark on some of the streets that you're not sure you should be able to go down that alley, you'll make it out the other side. The 1880s was starting to, calm down a little bit in London. So I kind of enjoyed going back to a period in which, there was more of a sense of unrest and danger because, London was still trying to decide what kind of metropolis it wanted to be at that point. Yes, it took research though.
And there's such an atmospheric quality to this book, because as you were talking about that, I thought about the scene where they're in the little trap, secret room, and you say she turns on the gas lights and there's this whoosh sound, and you kind of, I thought that was really atmospheric, so really detailed research there. The last question is about research, and we've talked about it. And Anonymous wants to know if you prefer primary sources or do you like to find modern compilations on a topic. This is the part I wanted to read. You post the best in capital, capitals, history and culture articles on Facebook. So follow Meredith on Facebook.
Awesome.
And I wonder if these are things that have come up in your research.
You know what? Yes, they've come up in my research. The answer, do I prefer primary sources or secondary? Both. I'm a huge history geek. I'm the biggest geek about Tudor England, which I don't even write about. I just read Young and Damned and Fair. It's this new book about Catherine Howard, which was like, I was like, I need to write. I can't pull myself away from this book though. So basically, it looks like I'm just sort of doing the Meredith Duran thing, but I'm not. I'm just geeking out, posting anything that I personally find fascinating. I'm glad you enjoy it though. That's awesome to know that people are enjoying that.
That's great. We are out of time, but I do like to always ask what you're reading currently and what you're liking and what you'd like to recommend, which was another great segue. But we also have a question that says what your go-to comfort reads are. So really quickly about
go-to comfort reads. Well, in historical romance, I'm really consistent. When I am feeling like there are moments where a book is fighting me, and my brain feels flat and arid, and like I can't grasp the language. And then I go to Judith Ivory, aka Judy Cuevas, who wrote I think she wrote 9 books under those 2 pen names, and Bliss and Dance and Untie My Heart, I think, are 3 of the greatest historical romances that have been or will ever be written. Her words are like poetry, and she finds these extraordinary ways to describe these mundane moments that blow your mind because you're like, I had never thought about it that way. And she just transports me when I read her. I have before publicly volunteered to take dictation from her if she's still out there and like wants to write another book, and I reiterate that offer. So Judy Cuevas, Judith Ivory is definitely my main comfort read. And Julianne Long's Like No Other Lover also has the same effect on me. I love that book. And as far as current reading, I've just been geeking out on the Tudors for a while. So yeah, Young and Damned and Fair is fantastic. Now I'm on to reading a biography of Jane Boleyn, who I thought was a villain, but this book is convincing me maybe I've misunderstood her. So yeah.
That's fabulous, and we're out of time.
Okay,
So thank you
so
much. This was so fabulous,
Yeah,
and we
great.
could just keep talking. And I get to actually keep talking to her for a bit, but I'm going to have to say bye to you. Thank you so much for tuning in. This again is Author's Voice, and we hope that you will be back next week on August 23rd for A House Divided, when it returns with author Walter Starr, whose new book is called Stanton, Lincoln's War Secretary. Meet the man who not only won Lincoln's trust during the war, he defended the peace and even took part in the first impeachment of an American president. That's Wednesday, August 23rd at 2 p.m. All your educational needs and more here at Author's Voice. So come back to authorsvoice.net for updates and details as we get closer to those dates. Our next Lit with Love show is going to be with Amy Rickard for her book, The Simplicity of Ciders. So I hope that you will come back for that as well. Thank you, and bye-bye, and thanks, Meredith.
Thank you.